History has a way of coming full circle, often with a touch of irony. In the mid-20th century, it was the Soviet Union under Generalissimo Joseph Stalin that bankrolled Mao Zedong's communist insurgency, helping him win the Chinese Civil War and establish the People's Republic. Moscow was the elder brother, Beijing the diligent student. 70 years later, the roles have been dramatically reversed. The Soviet Union is gone, and Vladimir Putin's Russia, locked in a grinding, full-scale war in Ukraine, now finds itself kneeling before others. Its ability to sustain the fight depends heavily on foreign support, which Putin must seek from Iran, North Korea, and above all, China. And while Beijing does not openly send weapons or military advisors, it supplies a vast array of dual-use components that keep Russia's war machine alive, from nitrocellulose for gunpowder production to CNC machinery for arms factories, and microelectronics and semiconductors for missile guidance systems. In short, China provides nearly everything Putin needs to pursue his vision of subjugating Ukraine and reasserting dominance over the post-Soviet space. This raises a central question. What price will the Kremlin have to pay for Chinese support? Has Putin, in chasing a 19th century imperial dream, what he now calls the Ruski Mir, Russian world, placed his country on a path toward losing its economic and geopolitical independence? Put more bluntly, is Russia becoming a vassal of China? The vassalization thesis is undeniably provocative. Some analysts now speak openly of Moscow as a new tributary of Beijing. Others dismiss such claims as sensationalist. But 3 years into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we finally have enough hard data to examine this question with clarity. To grasp the depth of Russia's current dependence on China, one must go back to the year 2000, when Vladimir Putin took power in the Kremlin. At that time, Russia still enjoyed unquestioned military and technological superiority over China, and no one in Moscow saw Beijing as an equal partner. Putin's priority was to restore Russia's geopolitical stature after the humiliation and chaos of the 1990s. And the key partner in that project was not China, but Europe, with its investment capital and advanced technology. Two watershed moments would later change this balance, both tellingly linked to Ukraine. The first came in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the West responded with sanctions. Moscow's answer was the so-called pivot to the east, a strategic embrace of China symbolized by the launch of the Power of Siberia gas pipeline and a 30-year, $400 billion gas deal signed the same year. Yet the true purpose of this pivot was not to sever ties with the West, but to signal that Russia had alternatives in Asia. In practice, however, Russian elites resisted deeper integration with China, steering clear of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative and promoting their own projects instead, as the Eurasian Economic Union. This strategy of balancing between Europe and China lasted until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Despite years of rhetoric about a pivot to the east, on the eve of the war, the European Union was still Russia's dominant economic partner. The EU accounted for 38% of Russian exports, compared with just 14% for China, and 32% of Russian imports, versus 25% for China. This was not merely a matter of volume. Europe provided the Kremlin with a lucrative, stable, hard currency market for its hydrocarbons, and just as crucially, a steady flow of advanced technologies, machinery and industrial know-how. February 24, 2022 changed all of that. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine upended not only Europe's security architecture, but the very foundations of Russia's economic model. Unlike the muted Western response to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the reaction to the 2022 invasion was swift and severe. Russia was hit with an unprecedented array of sanctions. Between 2021 and 2024, the EU share of Russian imports collapsed from 32% to 10%, while its share of Russian exports fell from 38% to 15%. These ties will almost certainly continue to erode. With this, Moscow lost its largest market and the ability to play Europe off against China. After February 24th, only one option remained: one market, one partner. China became the Kremlin's sole lifeline, and dependence deepened accordingly. The first proof of this growing dependence is the tectonic shift in Russia's trade patterns. Into the vacuum created by Russia's severed ties with Europe, China moved instantly. Bilateral trade surged to a record $245 billion in 2024. China's share of Russian imports rose from roughly 25% in 2021 to nearly 50% by 2024. Meanwhile, its share of Russian exports doubled, from 15 to 30%. The raw volume of trade, however, does not tell the full story. The real picture of dependence emerges when we look at the structure of that trade, one that mirrors a classic post-colonial pattern: raw materials in exchange for finished goods. It is no coincidence that analysts increasingly describe Russia as China's resource hinterland, or even a, quote, resource puppet state. Russia now exports to China almost exclusively low-value, minimally processed commodities, while importing high-value, technologically advanced goods. The numbers could not be clearer. Unprocessed raw materials account for roughly 90% of Russia's exports to China, primarily fossil fuels, metals, ores, and timber. In return, Russia imports only manufactured products. More than half of all Chinese imports consist of machinery and equipment, 23%, vehicles, 21%, and electronics, 15%. It is also important to note that while China has become an existential partner for Russia over the past 3 years, a relationship on which the Kremlin's survival now depends, Russia remains a secondary player in China's economic universe. The numbers speak for themselves. Despite record-high bilateral trade, Russia's share of China's global commerce remains marginal. In 2024, Russia accounted for only 3% of China's total exports and 5% of its imports. Combined, Russia represented a mere 4% of China's foreign trade. An equally dramatic shift is visible in the currency markets. While Vladimir Putin casts Russia as a leader in the global struggle against the dollar's hegemony and speaks of restoring monetary sovereignty, the hard data tells a very different story. In Russia's case, de-dollarization has meant one thing: yuanization. Cut off from the SWIFT system, Russia was forced to shift its commercial settlements to China's CIPS network. At the same time, the share of the yuan in Russia's international trade exploded. Before 2022, only about 0.4% of Russian trade was settled in the Chinese currency. Today, that figure is roughly 40%. The yuan has also become Russia's primary reserve currency. It now accounts for around 60% of the National Welfare Fund, the Kremlin's financial safety cushion. On Moscow's MOEX exchange, the yuan's share of transactions climbed to 54% in May last year, and after US sanctions on the exchange in June 2024, yuan trading surged to 99.8% of all activity. This yuanization gives Beijing enormous leverage over Moscow. Russia's financial stability, its foreign currency reserves, and even its ability to conduct international trade now hinge on decisions made in the People's Bank of China. The Kremlin tolerates this deep economic asymmetry for a simple reason: China is powering Russia's war machine. Russia's production of tanks, missiles, and ammunition is now critically dependent on Chinese imports across key industrial sectors. Beijing has become Russia's largest supplier of so-called dual-use goods. It delivers, at scale, the semiconductors, advanced CNC machinery needed for precision arms manufacturing, optics for targeting systems, and nitrocellulose, a core ingredient in artillery propellant. The data is stark. By 2023, roughly 90% of Russia's microelectronics imports came from China. Imports of Chinese CNC machines rose sharply, reaching nearly 70% of all deliveries by the end of 2023. Exports of nitrocellulose, virtually non-existent before the war, jumped to 700 tons in 2022 and more than 1,300 tons in 2023. China's support is also highly adaptive, shifting quickly to meet Russia's immediate battlefield needs. For example, in the autumn of 2022, as Russian forces constructed defensive lines in anticipation of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, Chinese exports of construction equipment to Russia surged nearly fourfold. It was this Chinese equipment that helped build the now famous Surovikin line, which blunted Ukraine's spring 2023 offensive. Drones offer another telling example. As the war has evolved into large-scale use of fiber optic guided drones, Chinese support has again adjusted. In August this year alone, China exported to Russia approximately 528,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable and $47 million worth of lithium-ion batteries. China has also become a major conduit for sanctions evasion. A report by the Kyiv School of Economics found that 18% of the critical components Russia uses on the battlefield, formerly imported from China, are in fact Western-made parts routed to Russian missiles and tanks through networks of intermediaries in China and Hong Kong. The conclusion is simple and brutal. Without China, Russia's war machine would slow dramatically, or perhaps grind to a halt. Russia's ability to wage a long war in Ukraine now depends, de facto, on Beijing. And fortunately for Putin, Beijing has no interest in ending the war quickly. China sees strategic advantages of its own. The conflict accelerates Beijing's expansion into Central Asia at Russia's expense, while simultaneously diverting US attention and resources away from the Indo-Pacific, and also makes Russia more dependent on China. On February 4, 2022, just 3 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping signed a joint declaration in Beijing, proclaiming a partnership, quote, without limits and cooperation with no forbidden areas. The partnership has indeed deepened, but on terms crafted almost entirely in Beijing, not Moscow. With such enormous leverage, control over Russia's economy and war machine, China is now using it to pursue its own hard interests. Moscow accepts the asymmetry because it has no meaningful room to maneuver. Nothing illustrates this imbalance more clearly than the endlessly stalled negotiations over the power of Siberia to gas pipeline. For Russia and Gazprom, the project is existential. It would reroute the same West Siberian gas fields that once supplied Europe and connect them to the Chinese market. For Moscow, this is a strategic lifeline, the only escape hatch for its gas industry after losing the EU. Beijing, however, is in no hurry. It is deliberately dragging out the negotiations to force Russia into accepting highly unfavorable terms. Media reports indicate that China is demanding prices close to Russia's domestic, state-subsidized rates. It is also resisting the 30-year contract Moscow wants, pushing instead for much shorter commitments. The supposed no-limits partnership is further undermined by China's reluctance to invest in Russia. Although Beijing is happy to trade with Moscow, it is far less willing to place capital there. Russian data show a dramatic collapse in foreign direct investment. Total FDI fell from about $500 billion at the end of 2021 to just 220 billion by late 2024. And contrary to the Kremlin's expectations, Chinese capital has not filled this gap. As a report by the German Institute for International and Security Affairs notes, Chinese investment in Russia had always been modest. But since the start of the full-scale invasion, not a single major new project has been launched. For Beijing, the risks of long-term exposure to Russia's unstable, sanctions-ridden economy outweigh any potential benefits. The symbolism is striking. Even as Western energy giants like BP and Shell exited Russia en masse after 2022, China's state-owned giants refused to buy their assets, fearing the consequences of Western secondary sanctions. All of this reveals Beijing's true hierarchy of priorities. First, economic ties with the West remain far more important to China than assuming full economic control over Russia. Second, Beijing understands Moscow's desperation. Russia has no alternative partners, no leverage, and no escape. So why should China risk costly sanctions or invest billions in an unstable wartime economy when it can simply buy discounted Russian commodities and dictate the terms of trade? Russia's growing economic dependence is steadily translating into a loss of geopolitical influence. The price Putin pays for Chinese support is an implicit acceptance of junior partner status on what was once Moscow's uncontested turf. Central Asia, Russia's soft underbelly, has for centuries been its exclusive sphere of influence. The war in Ukraine has upended that order. Drained militarily and financially, Russia no longer has the resources to maintain its hegemonic position in the region. China has moved into this vacuum swiftly and relentlessly. The clearest sign of this shift is the rapid rise of the C+C5 diplomatic format, a forum bringing together China and the 5 Central Asian states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, pointedly excluding Russia. In 2022, shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, the format was elevated to meetings at the level of heads of state. Beijing has also begun expanding into the security sphere, boosting arms exports to Central Asia and establishing a military base in Tajikistan. According to leaks, Uzbekistan, seeking to modernize its air force, may soon sign a deal with China for next-generation fighter jets. At the same time, Beijing is aggressively pushing toward major infrastructure projects, aimed at achieving one strategic objective: bypassing Russian territory and breaking Moscow's monopoly on transit between Asia and Europe. The most significant of these projects is the long-planned China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railway, whose construction finally began in the spring of 2025. A weakened Russia cannot block these initiatives. It must quietly accept them. The region has effectively fallen into an unspoken division of roles. Russia for now provides security through its military bases, while China takes over the economy and infrastructure. It is a classic dependency model in which the weaker partner, Russia, maintains order on the periphery for the dominant power, China, which reaps the real benefits. A similar dynamic, though on a smaller scale, is emerging in the Arctic. Desperate for Chinese technology and capital to exploit its northern resources, Russia is increasingly forced to grant Beijing access to a region it long regarded as an exclusive sphere of influence. Despite overwhelming evidence of deepening asymmetry, the vassalization thesis still faces resistance from some analysts. They argue that Russia retains certain attributes that set it apart from a classic satellite state and give the Kremlin a measure of strategic room to maneuver. First, Russia remains the world's largest nuclear power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Its nuclear arsenal acts as Moscow's ultimate insurance policy, one that prevents Beijing from exerting hard coercion. In several narrow military technical fields, such as jet engines and advanced air defense systems, Russia still maintains an edge over China, giving it a limited but genuine bargaining chip. Russian raw materials also carry strategic weight in the event of a potential US maritime blockade of China. The Kremlin is also making deliberate efforts to diversify its foreign relationships. It's intensifying cooperation with India, a strategic rival of China, as well as with Iran and the Gulf states, is aimed at creating political counterweights to Chinese influence and avoiding total dependence on a single partner. Do these arguments refute the idea of structural dependence? No, but they do clarify its nature. In reality, none of these factors can offset the fundamental asymmetry in the economic, technological, and financial dimensions. A nuclear arsenal may safeguard the survival of the Russian state, but it does not shield its economy from yuanization, nor does it free its war machine from reliance on Chinese CNC tools and semiconductors. Similarly, Moscow's attempts at diversification have limited effect. Neither India nor Iran possesses the economic or technological capacity to replace China as Russia's primary lender, its critical export markets for raw materials, or its supplier of essential components on the required scale. Even Russia's niche technological advantages have become assets the Kremlin is increasingly willing to trade for immediate Chinese support, rather than a basis for genuine autonomy. Modern vassalization does not require governing a country through one's ambassador. It is about constructing an architecture of dependence so tight that the weaker partner cannot escape without incurring catastrophic costs. Russia still maintains the outward trappings of great power status and retains freedom of action in secondary matters, but in the areas essential to regime survival and the continuation of the war, its strategic autonomy has shrunk dramatically. This leads to a critical question: why do the Kremlin elites, fully aware of this growing imbalance, accept it? The answer lies not only in economic necessity, but also in ideology. And so the hypothesis of Russia's vassalization by China largely holds up. Moscow's dependence on Beijing has become structural, deeply asymmetric, and most importantly, steadily increasing. China controls Russia's key financial flows, yuanization, powers its war machine, and is systematically pushing it out of traditional spheres of influence such as Central Asia. Alexander Gabuyev, director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin, stresses that this is no accidental process. Russia is, in his words, locking itself into vassalization. The Kremlin is fully aware of the growing asymmetry and the erosion of its strategic autonomy, but it accepts this reality. For Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine and the confrontation with the West have become an overriding principle, if not an outright obsession, subordinating the entire machinery of the state. In this worldview, Chinese support is priceless, and its cost merely secondary. Putin himself has supplied the ideological justification for Moscow's strategic turn toward China, drawing on deeply rooted historical analogies. On November 3, 2023, during a meeting with Russia's Civic Chamber, he invoked the figure of the 30th century Prince Alexander Nevsky. Putin reminded his audience that Nevsky traveled east to the Golden Horde to obtain a yarwyk, a formal license to rule, which allowed him to marshal the strength needed to defend Rus from Western invaders, namely the Teutonic Knights. Putin stated openly, quote, "The Horde, the Mongols, behaved arrogantly and cruelly, but they did not touch what mattered most: our language, traditions, and culture, precisely what Western conquerors sought to destroy. In many ways, the same thing is happening today." Unquote. The analogy is strikingly candid. In Putin's retelling, the modern horde is China, while the Western conquerors are NATO and the United States. As Gabuyev interprets it, Putin is making a conscious strategic choice. He prefers to be a vassal of a Chinese power that does not interfere in Russia's internal affairs and does not threaten its cultural identity, if that dependence allows him to wage what he sees an existential struggle against the West. portrayed as decadent and morally dangerous to Russia. The loss of economic sovereignty becomes the price for preserving cultural sovereignty and sustaining an anti-Western crusade. This vassalization, however, does not mean total or unconditional subordination. As Gabuyev notes, even North Korea retains some room to maneuver vis-à-vis Beijing. Russia will likewise try to preserve the appearance of autonomy. But on the issues that matter, it is China that holds the decisive voice. Acting pragmatically and in its own self-interest, Beijing will continue using its growing leverage to extract further concessions from Moscow. Access to Russia's most advanced military technologies, preferential entry into the Arctic and Siberian resource sectors, and in the future perhaps even limits on Russian military cooperation with China's rivals, such as India or Vietnam. What future awaits Russia in this new role? Gabuyev sketches a vision of Russia as a giant Iran of Eurasia, a country permanently cut off from the West, with a more technologically backward and simplified economy. Yet, like Iran, it will remain sanctions resilient, self-sufficient in key sectors, and capable of sustaining advanced weapons programs. The regime will not collapse, but Russia will be fundamentally transformed, losing part of its agency and becoming a crucial instrument in Beijing's global rivalry with Washington. The final balance sheet for Russia is both tragic and deeply ironic. Vladimir Putin, obsessed with subjugating Ukraine and restoring imperial dominance in Eastern Europe, has created a reality in which his regime's survival depends on a yarwyk issued in Beijing. The price of his imperial dreams in the West has been the loss of Russia's strategic sovereignty in the East.